The gymnasium at Huron Crest High still smelled like varnish and old rope, the same smell Dane Wexford remembered from graduation night 19 years ago. Blue and gold balloons drifted along the rafters. Under a banner that read 8 years strong, Vanessa Dade lifted one manicured finger and pointed it straight at him, laughing loud enough for 3 tables to turn. Still fixing other people's furniture, Dane? The room laughed with her, the easy kind of laugh that costs nothing. Dane straightened his cuff, one button at a time, and said nothing at all. Across the gym, near the folding tables of lemonade, a woman in a navy blazer went very still, watching him instead of laughing. Dane had not planned to stay long. He had come because Sadie asked to see the gym where her father used to play, and because a promise made to a 9-year-old outweighs almost any argument a grown man can make against himself. He stood near the doorway in a jacket he had owned for 6 years, watching the balloons sway on their ribbons, half hoping no one would recognize him at all. Someone always did. Coach Tolliver's old assistant, selling insurance in Dexter now, pumped his hand and asked how he was holding up, the way people ask about whether they've already decided is bad. A woman from his calculus class said she'd heard about the divorce, said it gently, the way people say things they've rehearsed on the drive over. Dane answered in short sentences, and let them fill the silence with their own guesses about what his life had become. Sadie tugged his sleeve. "Dad, can I go play? There's kids by the balloons. Stay where I can see you." She ran off toward a cluster of children near the gold balloon arch, sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, and Dane let himself watch her the way he always did in crowded rooms, counting her laugh among the noise like a man keeping time on something that mattered more than anything else in the building. "Mr. Wexford?" He turned. The woman in the navy blazer had crossed the gym floor without seeming to hurry, the way some people move through rooms as if the room had already agreed to make space for them. "Harper Quill," she said, offering her hand. "I'm the principal here now. Sadie's in my building 3 afternoons a week for the after-school program." "I know who you are," Dane said. "You sent home the field trip form last month. I signed it wrong twice." Harper almost smiled. Most parents do. It's not an intuitive form. She didn't ask about the divorce. She didn't glance at his jacket the way the others had, cataloging its age, its cuffs, deciding something about him from the fabric. She simply looked at him the way she might look at any father watching his daughter across a gym floor, which was, Dane realized somewhere in the back of his mind, the first time all evening anyone had. "You come to a lot of these?" he asked. "Every reunion since I took the job. Somebody has to keep the balloon arch from falling on the punch table." She glanced towards Sadie, laughing with 2 other girls near the gold streamers. "She's good with the younger kids. Patient. Gets that from her mother," Dane said, and then wondered why he'd said it, since it wasn't entirely true, and Harper didn't press. A man Dane vaguely remembered from the debate team, heavier now and balding at the crown, wandered over with a paper cup of lemonade and clapped him on the shoulder like they'd been close, though Dane could not, in that moment, recall his first name at all. "Wexford. Man, it's been a minute. You still up on Birch Street?" "Different place now," Dane said. Right. Divorce, I heard. Rough stuff." The man said it with the particular cheerfulness of someone relieved the misfortune belonged to another life entirely. "You doing okay for yourself, though? Working?" "I get by," Dane said, and the man nodded like that confirmed something he'd already assumed, then drifted off toward the drink table without waiting for anything more specific. Harper watched the exchange without comment, and when the man was out of earshot she said, quietly, "People ask questions like that as if there's a right answer they're already grading you on. Most of them already picked my grade 8 years ago," Dane said. "I stopped studying for the test a while back." That earned an actual smile this time, small and real, gone before it could become anything either of them needed to name. The doors at the far end opened again, and the temperature of the room changed before anyone spoke a word. Vanessa came in on Preston Dade's arm, and heads turned the way. Heads turn for people who expect it and have learned to enjoy the turning. She wore the kind of confidence that comes from being told, repeatedly and by people with something to gain, that a room is lucky to have her in it. Preston walked beside her with the particular stillness of a man used to being the reason a room quiets down, nodding at faces he recognized as donors before he recognized them as classmates. She found Dane across the gym within seconds. The way she always used to find the one thing in a room that would unsettle her fastest, and her eyes did the old thing they used to do, sliding down and back up, deciding what to say before she'd even reached him. It didn't take her long. Within the hour, Vanessa had drifted to the circle nearest Dane, trailing 3 women who had been her friends since junior year and were still, apparently, available for an audience whenever she needed one. Dane still does the woodworking thing, she said to them, not lowering her voice at all, letting it carry the way she wanted it to carry. Tables, shelves. It's sweet, really. Some men just never quite figure out what's next. I like the work, Dane said. You always did like small things. There was an old blade under the words, the kind sharpened over 8 years of retelling the same story to people who hadn't been in the room the first time. I remember when you had nothing left but a workbench and a truck payment. Guess some things don't change. One of Vanessa's friends, a woman named Diane who used to sit behind Dane in trigonometry, laughed nervously and tried to soften it. Dane, don't listen to her. Honestly, custom furniture is having a moment right now. My sister paid a fortune for a farmhouse table. It's fine, Dane said, mild, unbothered on the surface. Wood doesn't care what anyone thinks of it. Neither do I, most days. See, that's what I always liked about you, Vanessa said, though the compliment arrived wrapped in the same condescension as everything else she'd said so far. Simple, uncomplicated. Preston's whole world runs on complications, don't you, Preston? Preston, 3 feet away and half listening to another conversation, lifted his glass without quite following what he was agreeing to. Dane didn't answer. His eyes went once, briefly, to Sadie by the balloon arch, confirming she was too far to hear any of it, and then he simply stood, spine straight, hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man who had learned a long time ago that silence costs an opponent far more than a reply ever could. His phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. Then again, insistent, he glanced down out of habit, and the screen lit with a name that meant nothing to anyone standing in that gym. A scheduling assistant, confirming a board meeting at 3 o'clock the following afternoon. Ashgrove Dynamics, the caller ID read, plain as a grocery list, gone again before anyone but him could register it. Across the circle, Preston finally tuned back into the conversation long enough to add his own small contribution. Woodworking's a good hobby, he said, in the tone of a man handing out a compliment he hadn't earned the right to give. Good for the hands, keeps a man occupied. He said it the way he might have said something kind about a dog, and went back to his phone before Dane could decide whether it deserved a response at all. Harper was close enough to see it anyway. She said nothing, but something in her face shifted. The small private shift of a person who has just read a sentence and realized, halfway through, that it means something different than they first assumed. Dane silenced the phone and slid it back into his pocket, but the motion knocked something else loose. A slim access card slipped free of the lining and skittered across the polished floor, spinning once before it landed face up near Harper's shoe. She bent without thinking. The automatic courtesy of returning a dropped thing to its owner, and for half a second, before she straightened and held it out, she read it. D. Wexford founder and CEO, Ashgrove Dynamics. The photograph was recent. The title was not a joke, and not a mistake, and not anything a man like the one standing in front of her, the one Vanessa had just called sweet and small, was supposed to be carrying in his jacket pocket at a high school reunion. Harper held the card out, her hand steady. You dropped this. Thank you, Dane said, and took it, careful, and their eyes held a beat longer than the moment required, long enough that Vanessa, still mid-sentence to her friends about truck payments and small things, didn't notice anything at all, and long enough that Harper understood, without a single word passing between them, that she had just seen something she was not meant to see, and that he knew exactly that she had. That night, Dane drove Sadie home under a sky just beginning to purple at the edges, and instead of turning toward the apartment, he turned toward the workshop instead, the way he did most nights when the day had asked more of him than it should have. The shop sat behind a hardware store on the edge of town, smelling of sawdust and linseed oil, lit by a single bulb hanging over the bench on a cord he kept meaning to replace. He owned a company that could have bought the whole block and rebuilt it in glass and steel within a year, and still he came here every night to run his hands over grain and joints because it was the one place nobody asked him to be anyone other than exactly who he was. Sadie climbed onto the stool by the window, swinging her feet, sanding the corner of a small wooden box he'd started for her weeks before. "Can we finish it tonight?" "We can finish the sanding," Dane said, pulling his own stool up beside her. "Varnish takes a day to dry, and you know the rule about rushing varnish. It gets cloudy. It gets cloudy." He checked her grip on the sandpaper, adjusted her wrist slightly, said nothing else, and for a while there was only the soft rasp of paper on wood and the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. "Aunt Vanessa was mean tonight," Sadie said eventually, not looking up from the box, the way children sometimes deliver the heaviest sentences while doing something with their hands so it doesn't feel like they've said anything heavy at all. Dane kept sanding. "You heard that?" "Some of it. I wasn't trying to." She turned the box over, checking the underside. "You didn't say anything back." "Sometimes not saying anything is the strongest thing you can do," Dane said, "especially when the person saying it wants you to say something back." Sadie considered this with the total seriousness of a 9-year-old weighing a new rule about the universe. "Okay," she said finally, satisfied enough, and went back to sanding the corner she'd already smoothed twice. His phone rang while she worked. Silas Renner, his voice as flat and careful as it always was on business calls, even after 11 years of trusting each other with things that could end careers if they landed in the wrong hands. "Routine update," Silas said. "Ashgrove picked up a distressed note this week, a local real estate outfit that overextended on a mixed-use project downtown. Small deal. Wouldn't normally flag it for you, except the borrower's name is Dade Properties." Dane's hand paused on the box lid. "Preston Dade. You know him?" "I know his wife," Dane said, and left it there, because Sadie was 3 feet away humming to herself over her sandpaper, and some sentences don't belong near a child's ears, even when she isn't listening closely. Silas, who had learned over the years exactly which silences were worth leaving alone, didn't push further. Across town, in an empty gym now stripped of its balloons and its banner, Harper Quill was folding tablecloths by herself, replaying a photo identification card in her head, over and over, as the way a person replays a sentence they can't quite believe they read correctly. She had told no one. She told herself she wouldn't. Not because it was a secret worth keeping for its own sake, but because it plainly wasn't hers to spend. Sadie held up the box, pleased with a corner she'd finally smoothed to her own satisfaction. Dane turned it in the light of the bare bulb, checked the joint with his thumb, nodded once. "Good work." She grinned, like the sentence weighed more than 3 words should. Somewhere in that same hour, a text arrived on Vanessa's phone from a number she didn't recognize, signed only as legal assistant, reunion fund, reminding her she was expected to give opening remarks at Saturday's gala. She read it twice, mildly annoyed at the formality of the wording, and didn't think, even once, to wonder who had actually sent it, or why it had come at all. Harper was at the front gate the next morning when Dane pulled up to collect Sadie early for a dentist appointment, and for the first time since he'd known her strictly as a school administrator, the conversation didn't feel like a transaction between a parent and an institution. She asked about the box he was building. He asked how the after-school program was running with half its usual custodial staff out sick. Neither of them mentioned a card on a gymnasium floor, though it sat between the sentences the whole time, unspoken and obvious. "The lab renovation stalled," Harper said eventually, glancing toward the half-finished science wing behind the main building, scaffolding still standing from a spring that had come and gone. "We had a donor lined up. Anonymous. Verbal commitment. Nothing formally signed." It's been 3 months of silence. "That happens sometimes," Dane said, carefully, and meant it more than she could have known standing there. "It shouldn't. Not to kids who've been promised microscopes since September." She said it without bitterness, just fact, the tone of someone used to absorbing disappointment on behalf of children who couldn't fight for themselves yet. "I keep telling the students it's coming. I'm running out of ways to say that without it sounding like a lie." "You believe it's coming?" "I have to," Harper said. "Otherwise, what am I doing here?" She said it lightly, but Dane heard the weight underneath it, the particular exhaustion of a person who carries other people's disappointments home with her every evening, whether she wants to or not. Preston Dade's black sedan rolled through the drop-off lane a moment later, and even idling at the curb he managed to occupy the space like it already belonged to him. He rolled his window down to address a young teacher hurrying past with a stack of folders under one arm, told her, not unkindly exactly but not kindly either, that the reunion committee needed the auditorium cleared faster next time, that his schedule didn't allow for delays like Fridays. The teacher nodded and hurried on without arguing. Preston didn't look at Dane at all, which was, Dane thought, its own kind of message, deliberate in its carelessness. His phone rang before he'd even reached his truck. Vanessa, breezy, asking whether he could take Sadie an hour earlier on gala night, since she and Preston had a pre-event dinner planned with donors. It's a big deal for him, she said. City council announcements coming soon. And optics matter. You remember what that's like well. A small laugh, not cruel exactly, just careless, tossed off the way she used to toss off things that once landed harder than she ever bothered to notice. Maybe you don't remember actually. I'll take her early, Dane said, and hung up before she could add anything else. He stood by the truck a moment afterward, and when he looked up, Harper was still near the gate, close enough to have heard the shape of the call if not every word, far enough to reasonably pretend she hadn't. Neither of them said anything about it. She held his gaze for a second, then turned back toward the building, and something about the not saying felt more honest than anything either of them might have offered instead. The report came from Silas on Thursday afternoon. 3 pages, no commentary beyond a subject line that read for your eyes only. Dade Properties had borrowed heavily against a mixed-use development downtown, and the note had been quietly absorbed into a lending subsidiary 3 layers beneath the Ashgrove name, close enough that Dane technically owned the debt, distant enough that Preston Dade had no idea whose signature ultimately backed the paper he'd signed. There was more, and it was worse. Buried in a footnote about the reunion fund's quarterly filing, a disbursement marked for the Huron Crest Science Wing had been delayed twice, both times around dates that lined up neatly with city council fundraising events on Preston's calendar. Dane read it 3 times at his workbench, the varnish drying untouched beside him under its plastic sheet, and understood that Preston wasn't simply slow with the paperwork. He was using the school's money as leverage for his own campaign, and no one at Huron Crest had any reason yet to suspect it. He sat with that for a long while, the bulb humming overhead. Acting on it meant stepping into daylight he had spent 8 years carefully avoiding, not out of shame, never that, but because Sadie deserved a childhood that didn't come with a headline stapled to it. Doing nothing meant watching a lab renovation die quietly, and a man like Preston keep climbing on money he'd never have to answer for, propped up by a fund meant for children who trusted adults to protect it. He thought about calling Silas back and telling him to bury the note, let some other lender absorb the risk, let Preston keep climbing on someone else's rope instead. It would have been easy. Nobody at Ashgrove would have questioned it, and nobody at Huron Crest would ever know how close the truth had come to surfacing, and then quietly didn't. But every time he turned the thought over, it kept arriving at the same place. A room full of kids without microscopes, and a man at a podium telling them he believed in their future while quietly starving it. Sadie found him still at the bench near bedtime, in socked feet, hair damp from her bath. Why does Mom laugh with Uncle Preston but not with you? Dane set the report face down on the bench. Different people laugh at different things, kiddo. He pulled her into a hug instead of an answer, because some questions a father can only hold, not solve, at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, with a folder of numbers sitting closed beside him. Friday morning, Harper's phone rang before first bell, the district office, informing her in careful bureaucratic language that the science wing's funding request had been formally tabled, indefinitely, pending further review. Pending what, exactly? Harper asked, and the voice on the other end had no real answer beyond the phrase itself, repeated with slightly different emphasis, as if that might make it mean something. She stood in her empty office a long moment after hanging up, looking out at the scaffolding through her window, and thought, not for the first time that week, and about a card with a title on it that hadn't matched the man carrying it at all. She wondered, not unkindly, what else in this town wasn't quite what it appeared to be from the outside, and whether she was the only one starting to notice. Silas came in person on Monday, 3 days before the gala, which was itself unusual enough that Dane knew before a single word was spoken that the news wasn't routine. He set a folder on the workbench between them, next to a half-sanded chair leg still clamped in place, and didn't sit down, which told Dane even more than the folder did. Preston used reunion fund assets as collateral for a personal loan, Silas said, without preamble. Not the school's operating budget, the charitable fund itself. The one that's legally supposed to be untouchable for anything but its stated purpose. He signed as an individual guarantor, using fund letterhead that implied board authorization he never actually had. That's not a gray area, Dane. That's fraud against a non-profit instrument, and as it happens, it runs straight through a subsidiary we own. Dane opened the folder and read slowly, the numbers arranging themselves into a shape he hadn't wanted, but couldn't unsee once he had. Somewhere in these pages was proof that the man his ex-wife had married, the man who had stood beaming at a podium about family commitment while she laughed at Dane across a gymnasium, had been quietly gambling with the school's future to fund his own ambition. If this goes public, Silas said carefully, it goes public through you. There's no clean way around that. You'll have to stand up and say the name Ashgrove out loud in a room that thinks it already knows what that jacket means about you. I'm aware. You've had 8 years of quiet, Dane. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I'm telling you once it's spent, you don't get it back. Silas said it not as a warning but as a fact, the way he said most things, and then he left the folder on the bench and let the silence do the rest of the arguing. Dane turned the pages again after Silas left, alone this time. The shop quiet except for the tick of the cooling bulb. He thought of Sadie asleep 2 rooms away in the apartment, of Harper standing at a gate 3 months into telling children a lab was coming that might never arrive, and of a banner in a gymnasium promising a future the fund's own chairman was quietly cannibalizing. Using it meant more than exposing Preston. It meant standing in front of the town he'd grown up in and telling them exactly who he had become, in front of Vanessa, in front of every person who had already decided years ago who he was and would always be. He called Harper that evening, kept it simple, no explanation offered up front. If an anonymous donor needed a few minutes at Saturday's gala, he said, would there be room on the program? There was a pause on the line, not long, but long enough to mean something real. There's always room for a donor, Harper said, anonymous or otherwise. She didn't ask what he meant by it. She didn't ask why now, or why her, or what had changed since Monday. Trust, Dane thought, listening to the quiet on the other end of the line, sounds a great deal like silence when it's given freely and without conditions attached. He sat alone at the bench after the call ended, the folder open under the single bulb, Sadie's finished box gleaming faintly with its first coat of varnish beside it, and made the decision the way he made most of the ones that mattered quietly, without needing anyone in the room to witness it first. The gala filled the same gymnasium that had held the balloons and the laughter weeks earlier, now dressed in white linens and strings of small warm lights, the old banner replaced with one reading, Huron Crest Futures Fund. Preston stood at a small podium near the free throw line, glass raised, telling the room how the Dade family had always believed in giving back to the community that raised them, how proud he was, how honored, how deeply invested in the children of this town. Vanessa found Dane near the back wall, Sadie standing beside him in a dress she'd insisted on wearing twice in 1 week, because she loved the way the hem moved. Didn't expect to see you here again, Vanessa said, light enough to sound like nothing, sharp enough to be exactly what it was meant to be. This is a bit above the toolbox crowd, don't you think? Dane didn't answer. He didn't need to. Harper stepped to the podium a moment later, thanked Preston warmly for his remarks, and then, in the same even voice she used for morning announcements over the school intercom, said the Science Wing's anonymous donor had asked for 2 minutes to address the room, if the room would permit it. Dane walked to the podium in a jacket 6 years old, and told a gymnasium full of people who believed they already knew exactly who he was that he was the founder of Ashgrove Dynamics, in the company behind the lab renovation everyone in that room had been waiting 3 months to see funded. A murmur moved through the tables, the sound of 100 private assumptions collapsing at once. He didn't pause for it. The science wing will be finished by winter, he said. Fully funded, no conditions attached, no naming rights required. He let that sit a moment, then continued in the same even tone. I also want to bring something to the board's attention tonight, because I think this room deserves to hear it from someone who checked the paperwork, rather than someone who benefits from it staying hidden. He said, calmly, without theater, that Ashgrove currently held a note on Dade Properties, and that Preston Dade had used the Reunion Fund's charitable assets, against every rule governing such a fund, to guarantee a private loan on that very property. He read the relevant lines off the page the way a man reads a measurement off a tape. No more drama in his voice than that, and let the numbers carry whatever weight they needed to carry on their own. The room went silent in the particular way. A room goes silent when everyone in it realizes, at almost exactly the same moment, that they have misjudged something badly. Preston started to speak, some half-formed protest about context and misunderstanding, but 3 members of the school board seated in the front row already had copies of Silas's folder resting in their laps, delivered quietly an hour before doors opened. The vote to suspend Preston's role as fund chair happened right there, 6 votes to 1, before dessert had even been served to the back tables. Preston's face moved through several expressions in quick succession, disbelief giving way to calculation, calculation giving way to something closer to panic once he understood the board members weren't bluffing. He tried once more, quieter this time, to frame it as a temporary bridge loan he'd always intended to repay, but the room had already decided which version of the story it believed, and it wasn't his. Vanessa stood very still at the edge of the crowd, the laughter long gone from her face entirely, looking at Dane the way a person looks at an old photograph. They suddenly realized they've been reading upside down for 8 straight years without once turning it around. The story moved fast after that, the way small-town stories always do once they start moving at all. By Sunday, the local paper had run a headline about Huron Crest's mystery donor, though Dane gave no interviews and returned no calls from the 2 reporters who found his number. He drove Sadie home from the gala in the particular quiet the 2 of them shared best, her half asleep against the window with her shoes already off, and didn't bother turning the radio on for either of them. Vanessa came to the workshop 2 days later, alone, no warning given beforehand. She stood in the doorway a while before she spoke at all, the bare bulb throwing her shadow long across the sawdust floor. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I wasn't hiding it because I was ashamed," Dane said, not looking up from the bench right away. "I didn't want Sadie growing up around people who only ever looked at a number when they looked at her father. I still don't." "You let me say those things," Vanessa said, quieter now. "At the gym. All of it. You just stood there." "I let a lot of things go a long time ago that weren't worth the fight," Dane said. "That was one more." Vanessa didn't answer right away. Something in her face worked slowly through 8 years of a story she'd told herself, and everyone else so many times it had started to feel true regardless of the facts, and found, standing there in the sawdust, that it didn't fit anymore, not even a little. She left without an apology, but she left quieter than she'd arrived, and Dane understood, watching the door swing shut, that quiet was its own kind of beginning for someone like her. Harper texted that night, short and plain, nothing performative in it at all. "Thank you. Not for the money. For the way you did it." Dane read it twice before setting the phone face down on the bench, something loosening in his chest that had stayed tight since a gymnasium floor 8 years and 1 week ago. By Wednesday, a lawyer representing Preston had reached out to Silas requesting a private settlement, quiet terms, no further disclosure to press or board. The offer was generous, framed carefully around words like reputational cost and mutual benefit, the kind of language lawyers use when they're hoping the other side hasn't fully counted what it's owed yet. Silas forwarded the message along with a single line of his own. "Your call, no pressure either way." Dane read it standing at the bench, the varnish on Sadie's box finally cured and gleaming, and didn't answer right away, letting the question sit overnight the way he let most important ones sit before deciding anything. He thought about what a settlement would buy Preston's silence, mostly, and time, and the chance to quietly repair a reputation that hadn't been honestly earned in the first place. He thought about the folder still sitting in his truck, and about a room full of kids who were owed a working lab regardless of what happened to Preston Dade's name in the process. The city council took up the matter of Preston's fitness for candidacy the following week, and Dane was formally asked to give a statement for the record. He declined politely, and let the folder speak in his place instead, the way he had let most consequential things speak for him for most of his adult life. A council aide called twice more to press for a, quote, something usable for the meeting minutes, and both times Dane said the same thing. The documents were accurate, and he had nothing further to add to what was already written down in black and white. Preston withdrew from the race 2 days later, citing personal reasons that fooled almost no one in town. Word moved quickly after that, the way it does, that his marriage to Vanessa was already fraying badly at its edges. Voices audible some evenings through windows left open too long, neighbors trading half-heard fragments over fences, the way small towns always eventually do. Dane and Harper walked the half-finished science wing together on a bright Thursday afternoon. Hard hats slightly too large for both of them, sunlight cutting long lines through unfinished framing overhead. They weren't standing there strictly as a parent and a principal anymore. Not entirely, not the way they had been weeks before. Something easier had settled quietly between them, unhurried, the kind of thing that doesn't need a name attached to be entirely real. "Contractor says the counters go in next week," Harper said, running her hand along a stretch of raw plywood that would eventually be a lab bench. "Real ones this time, not the folding tables we've been promising the chemistry kids since spring." "They'll survive," Dane said. "Kids that age break folding tables just fine too. You'd know. I broke exactly one folding table in this building, and it was structurally unsound to begin with." He said it dry enough that Harper laughed. An actual laugh. Unguarded. The kind that had nothing to do with an audience. Sadie ran ahead of them across the bare plywood subfloor, pointing toward a wall where a plaque would eventually be mounted. "Can Uncle Silas come to the opening? He's never even seen the school." "I think he'd like that a lot," Dane said, and Harper smiled at the child's easy use of uncle for a man she'd met exactly twice in her whole life, the way families sometimes widen, without anyone ever formally deciding it out loud in a meeting. Weeks later, the school held its ribbon cutting for the finished lab, sunlight bouncing hard off new windows, students crowding the hallway with a nervous excitement that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with the microscopes finally arriving in their boxes. Vanessa stood at the edge of the crowd, farther back than she strictly needed to be, watching Dane stand beside Sadie and Harper near the ribbon. She didn't approach either of them. She gave a single small nod across the room instead, the kind that stands in for an apology that hadn't quite found its words yet, and Dane returned it just as small, and that was the whole conversation between them, complete in its brevity. He went back to the workshop that evening. Same bulb, same bench, same quiet he'd chosen over glass towers 100 times before, and would likely choose 100 times again. The work had never once been a disguise. Not for a single day of the last 8 years. It had always simply been the thing he wanted to do with his hands, when the rest of the day had asked too much of everything else in him. Harper stopped by an hour later, a rolled set of drawings tucked under one arm. Some idea about new shelving for the school library is an excuse thin enough that both of them recognized it instantly for what it actually was, and neither one minded in the slightest. She spread the drawings across the workbench, pointing out where the reading nook would go, where the shelves needed to clear a radiator that had been fighting the librarian for a decade. "You could just ask me to build it," Dane said. "You didn't need a set of drawings for that." "I know," Harper said, not looking up from the page. "I like watching you argue with a tape measure, though. It's very grounding." Sadie laughed from her stool by the window, watching the two adults argue gently over the correct length for a shelf board, measuring twice, marking pencil lines that stubbornly refused to agree with each other. Later, when Sadie had fallen asleep on the old couch in the corner, one arm dangling toward the floor, Dane opened a drawer and set something quietly on the bench between them, the access card Harper had once picked up off a gymnasium floor and handed back without asking a single question, now resting among wood scraps and a child's forgotten toys, exactly where he had chosen, deliberately, to keep it ever since. She hadn't asked him how rich he was. She had only ever asked in her own quiet way whether he'd still be here tomorrow, and that, it turned out, was the only answer he had ever truly wanted to give anyone.